Castlebar Workhouse during the Great Famine, and the speaker is a man from Castlebar. It's rarely we have a person from Castlebar speaking, but tonight we're delighted to have Dr. Gerard Moran here. There he is. Well, he told me a joke, but I'm not going to tell you. He told me he'd have my life if he did. Anyway, just to welcome you, and so I'll leave you to it. Thank you very much. Oh.
I don't think the microphone here is working sufficiently, but as I have lectured to groups of students of up to 400, and sometimes without a mic, as some of you will be aware, you just have to do it. So you just have to use your voice in a particular way. I must say it's great to be back in my old hometown, and what has absolutely fascinated me was to meet so many faces from the past here. And it was great seeing sort of people that I've been at school with, people who are great friends as I was growing up, and sort of even sort of some relations who've come along. When I was asked in relation to give the talk, and I was just thinking, I had done so much work on workhouses, and people often say to you, how come you have got this interest in workhouses? And in many ways it's circuitous, because many moons ago, when I was barely out of short trousers, I had an interest in the Irish immigration to North America in the 19th century. But one of the areas that really struck me were the number of people from the workhouses that were being sent to Australia, to Canada, to South Africa, and other places. For example, there were 400 people from the Cork workhouse sent out to the Panama to build the Panama Railway. Only one of them was alive a year later. But as a result of that, the work on immigration, I became increasingly interested in what was happening in workhouses. And it became very obvious we didn't know the full story of what happened in workhouses. For example, and one of the follows on to that was a collection of essays on children and the Great Famine, in which I did a piece on the role of children in the workhouses. And again, very, very few people knew about how children were treated. And if I put it to you this way, in some workhouses in Ireland, 2/3 of the pauper inmates were children under the age of 15. We're talking about, at one stage, 96,000 children. Now, most of the workhouses had at least 40 to 45% of the population as sort of children. A follow-on to that was with regards to, I noticed in quite a number of workhouses there were riots and insubordination, especially by women, and which led me on to doing work on the whole question of riots, where police and the constabulary had to be sent in to restore order. Another follow-up was the auxiliary workhouses, because by 1849 there are more paupers in the auxiliary workhouses than there are in the workhouses themselves. And then I noticed the big difference that you have between each individual workhouse. While the rules from the Poor Law Commissioners were the same, the manner in which they were interpreted, the manner in which they were carried out, all differed from workhouse to workhouse. I've looked at the materials for the workhouse, some of them in County Clare, also the one, Westport, Ballina, and of course Castlebar, for Kenmare, and for Ballinasloe. And none of them are the same. It depends on the Board of Guardians who looked after the workhouses, how they interpreted things. It depends on who was employed in the workhouses, how they treated the paupers. And it depended on the finances that were available. Why do I call it slaughterhouses? This is a term that is constantly coming up in 1850 and 1851, when the number of people in the workhouses is at a total height. I put it in context with you. In 1849, 926,000 people entered the workhouse at some stage. In other words, 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 of the population of Ireland in 1849 was an inmate in the workhouse. In one day in June of 1851, there are 256,000 people in the workhouses in Ireland. And it gives you a context in terms of the pressure that they were under. And this is the period in which you have very high mortality. And that's why, some of the newspapers at the nation describe the workhouses as slaughterhouses. Who are the people that used the workhouse in Castlebar? What do we know about them? We know that between 1845 and 1848, 4,600 people in Castlebar used the workhouse. One of these in 1851 was Mrs. Reid. Mrs. Reid decided to send her 3 children into the workhouse after her husband had died. Her husband had been a tradesman, and after his death, the family had been evicted by Lord Lucan. Mrs. Reid realised that she would not be able to look after her 3 children in Ireland. So she decided what I sometimes describe as the safety net. Sending your children to a place where the likelihood is they would be looked after. But that was not always the case with the workhouses. She leaves for England in search of work on the point that she will return, at some stage she will send for her children to join her. Within a week of her leaving, one of the children is dead. By 2 weeks later, the other 2 children are dead. I've often wondered, as I passed the workhouse, or where the workhouse stood, and I'll talk about that in a moment, how many people have passed by that road that I'm walking on. Because I remember the old workhouse in Castlebar, and I'm sure many of you do as well. And just to give you an indication of what it looked like, this is from 1945, and the workhouse was still there until the late 1960s. But this was what you actually had in virtually every town in Ireland. Because you have 130 of these workhouses that are built between 1840 and 1847. Why the gap? There was a problem in relation to securing money for the building of them. The British Treasury advanced 1.2 million for the building of these workhouses. The money had to be repaid over 10 years. But the problem was, by 1850, 1851, virtually all of the workhouses in Ireland were bankrupt. But I'm sure many of you remember this, and what it was like. The Poor Law was established in 1838. The reason for its establishment was more to do with pressure from the British authorities. because large numbers of Irish paupers were heading to England and ending up in the workhouses in England which had been established in 1834. So the government decided that they were going to set up workhouses in Ireland, and the law was passed in 1838. It was decided that you would have 130 workhouses in the country. It was pointed out from a very early stage that the workhouses would not be able to deal with the famine. Why do we call 1845 to 1852 the Great Famine? Anybody tell me?
One of many.
There were so many of the famines in the 19th century. According to the document in 1901, between 1815 and 1900, there were 29 famines, national famines, local famines, subsistence crises in the country. And here you get some idea that these are just some of them. 1816 to 17, major one, 1821 to 23, when over 1 million people had to be, aid has to be provided for them. Again, 1831, 35, and right up to 1845. Now, the architect of the poor law system, a guy by the name of Nichols, he realised that the workhouse system was not suitable in a famine situation. And in 1849, he gives evidence to quite a number of commissions in London, acknowledging that the workhouse system wasn't suitable for a famine situation in Ireland. And these are just some of the quotes that he makes. The occurrence of a famine, however, if general, seems to be a contingency altogether above the power of the poor law to provide for. And I never contemplated the state of things which we have seen in the past 4 years. If there is no produce from the land, then there can be no value on which to levy a poor rate without produce from the earth. But nevertheless, from 1840 onwards, the workhouses began to be built. The first workhouse to open was in South Dublin, Cork City, and this was where the old Fondling Hospital was located in Cork. This was followed by in 1840 April by the South Dublin Union, where James Street Hospital is located today. And you can see that the first ones that come in 1840 are all in towns, large urban areas. And again, Castlebar Workhouse, which comes into being in 1842. It was decided that Mayo would be divided up into 5 poor law unions. So you would have 5 workhouses. You had Ballina, Ballinrobe, Castlebar, Westport, and Swinford. Now, the first of the Mayo workhouses, it opened. Sorry, I'm just jumping ahead of myself here. In relation to Castlebar, what you have is the poor law system is governed by the boards of guardians. Now, I've often said that what you have is, this is the first attempt at local democracy in Ireland, is the introduction of the poor law in 1838. On account of the fact that you have 21 elected guardians, the Castlebar was divided into 10 electoral divisions. And this was where the rates would be paid for the support of the poor in that particular area. But you have 21 for the 10 electoral areas. Castlebar elected 4 guardians. Some other places like Athergool, 1 guardian and so on. But you also had ex officio guardians who were magistrates, landlords. And this was to give some type of cohesion to the system. The chairman for part of the period was Lord Lucan. In order to be able to vote for a guardian, you had to have a property qualification of £4. Each of the electoral divisions, the more land that you had there, the more votes that you had, up to a maximum of 6 votes. But if you had land in an adjoining electoral division, you also had votes in that electoral division as well. To become a poor law guardian, you had to have a certain property qualification. In some parts, it was £30. In other parts, especially in the west of Ireland, it was only £10. What this indicates, the difficulty in actually getting guardians. In some places, it was maintained that some of the guardians were as poor as the people inside in the workhouses. It was also maintained by one or two commentators that some of the guardians could not read or write and wondered what they were actually allowed onto these your sort of boards that you're sort of for. But the opening of the electoral area, the workhouses, you'll see there that the first one to open was Ballinrobe, May 1842, followed by Castlebar in October, then followed by Ballina in 43. Now, Swinford was the last of them. The one in Westport is quite interesting, on account of the fact the workhouse was built, but it couldn't open. It was ready for occupation in 1842, but they could not get the rates, the money, from ratepayers, in order to fund the workhouse. And it was only in the 1845 that the government sent in soldiers and constabulary to force money out of ratepayers. But Mayo, in 1841, had a population of 388,000. There are 4,100 places in the workhouses in Mayo. That meant it's 1 for every 92 of the population of Mayo. For Castlebar, it's 1 for every 87 of the population. Now, from the word go, it's quite obvious that the workhouse system is not able to cope with what is happening in 1845, 1846. One of the arguments was that the workhouse should be within 10 miles of people, that they would not have to travel further than 10 miles. But this was when we look at the size of the workhouses in the Mayo in particular, you'll see where the problem was. Sorry. Okay, the Ballina was the biggest of the workhouses in Ireland. It covered over 500,000 acres. It stretched from Dromore West in County Sligo right over to the Mullet Peninsula. And people in the Mullet Peninsula were 40 miles from the actual workhouse. Similarly, if you look at Westport, in the Westport Union, if you were on the furthest western part of Achill Island, you were 40 miles from the workhouse. During the famine, what actually happens is people in the Mullet and people in Achill try and get to the workhouses, only to be told they're full. There's no place for them, and they will have to return home. The number of fatalities is quite high, according to the statements that were given in evidence at the parliamentary select committees. And so this was one of the first points which did not hold up. The fact of having the workhouse within 10 to 12 mile radius of your sort of your people. Just to show you where the workhouse in Castlebar is, it's the present site of the Sacred Heart Home. That is where in the late 1960s, they pulled it down the old workhouse and started building there. Okay, along here, this is David's Terrace. So any of you who weren't aware that the workhouse was where the Sacred Heart Home is now, it gives you some sense of the location of it. But it gives you some idea as well. Here you have a fever hospital. And in 1851, on one day, there are 280 people in that little room. And that's what it basically was, a room. Up in the corner there, you can see the cemetery. I don't know if any of you remember when the old workhouse was being pulled down. But one of the memories that I have is seeing a bulldozer, and in the bulldozer you could see skeleton remains. And what actually happened was, okay, they gathered all of the bones and they're all interred in a communal sort of grave. But it gives you some sense of the location and some of the features associated with the workhouse. The most important people in the workhouse were the staff. The thing is, the staff were appointed by the Board of Guardians. And the most important ones were the master. And in 1845, just after it opened, the master was being paid £40 a year. The matron was receiving £20. In the late 1849-1850, the matron there was Miss Staunton. The clerk of the union was Mr. Penrose, who was paid £20. In addition, you had a medical doctor, and the doctor had a practice outside of the workhouse, but he could spend up to 6 or 7 hours a day, especially in 1849-1850. And the doctor in question here was John Barrett. You also had a schoolmaster, you had a schoolmistress. When the number started to increase quite substantially, an assistant master was appointed. Now these people made or broke the way in which the pauper inmates, the life that they had inside in the workhouse. Some of them were absolute terrorists. There's an incident from Ballinrobe where the workhouse master was a guy by the name of William Murphy, who they bet up and eventually killed a 12-year-old pauper boy who he had attacked. Many of the masters that were appointed to the workhouses came from a military background. The idea was you needed discipline, you needed order in the workhouses, and this could only be provided if people had a military background. And this is why many of them come from they're ex-soldiers, etc. However, many of the masters, there are major issues with them. There is a big issue in relation to many of them are constantly drunk. And part of the reason is the job that they actually have. There's also a major problem. Many of them apparently have, they're too familiar with the female paupers. More of them, there's a question with regards to the mishandling of money. And what actually happens is during the famine, over 70 workhouse masters are dismissed or lose their jobs because of these indiscretions. Similarly, some of the matrons also, for indiscretions, are sacked. But one of the difficulties that we have is that many of the staff that are employed, in Castlebar Workhouse included, they get the jobs because they're either related or friendly with guardians. We know that many of the relieving officers who collect the rates, they never kept books, so nobody knew who owed money and who did not. There was always the misappropriation of money with the relieving officers. And it was on account of the fact of the appointment of these people by the authorities. Oh, we're talking about the schoolmistress. The schoolmistress in 1850, she was the daughter of the rector of the Ackle Mission. Apparently, she could neither read or write, not to mention the pupils that she was teaching. So, but she had got the job purely on account of her connections within the system. With guardians. Okay, this is just some more in relation to the workhouse master came from military backgrounds. 70 were dismissed or got rid of. William Murphy, charged with the murder of the 12-year-old pauper in Battle Road, workhouse. How much did it cost to run a workhouse? A workhouse of about 700. This is similar to what Castlebar was. On average, it cost about £3,400. 86% of the money was spent on the inmates in the workhouse, or else even the people on outdoor relief, which was introduced in 1847. 8.8% was spent on salaries for the people we've just mentioned, and 5% on other outings such as the rent of other properties which were used as auxiliary workhouses. So you get some sense of where the money was actually going. Under the rules of 1838, the workhouses were to accommodate 100,000 paupers. From 1840, you can see the numbers are quite small. But even by 1845, when the first indications of a problem with the potato occurs, there are 11 workhouses that haven't opened. There are another 6 that they have only opened since January. So even in 1845, the workhouse was virtually full. You come down to 1846, and there's still workhouse, that one of Clifton, which hasn't opened. Again, the workhouses are virtually full. The 100,000, you're just 5,500 short of it. So you can see where the problems are beginning to occur. I mentioned already the numbers who were receiving relief in the workhouses. The 1849, about 1 in 6 to 1 in 7. June of 1851, in one day, 261,000. But if we look in Castlebar, what happens? Between June 1847 and March 1849, you're talking about 15 months. 8,600 people are in the workhouse at some stage. What you're talking about is about 1 in 8 of the population have had to spend some time in the Castlebar Workhouse. It shows you the pressure that Castlebar Workhouse was under. When it opened, the decision was made that they would only take in a workhouse pauper when somebody died or somebody left. By 1846, the workhouse is in such financial straits, it is only kept open through contributions by Lord Lucan. By 1847, there is total mayhem in the Castlebar Workhouse. Have I got it? No. This is just to give you some idea in relation to mortality. Between March and April of 1851, 137 deaths occur in the workhouse in Castlebar. It is one of the highest mortality rates in any part of the country. Here are some examples. Robert Dillon, who was aged 88 years. Biddy McHale, 2 years. One of the things that is really interesting, the number of children under 2 years of age who are dying in the workhouse. And part of the reason for that, I'll speak to in greater detail in a few moments, they were not getting the necessary types of food to keep them alive. When you entered the workhouse, the first thing happened was segregation. Men on one side, women on the other side. You have sort of children aged 2 to 9 sent to what were called nursery wards, one for boys, one for girls. Then those young adults from 10 to 15 years, you have one for girls and one for boys. The inside of the workhouses are certainly one of the most unpleasant places you could go to. It was ordered there would be no decorations, there would be no ornaments, there would be nothing to liven up the workhouse at all. Those sort of boys and girls 10 to 15 were put up on the top part. There was no ceiling. What they were looking at were the bare sort of timbers on the roof. When it came to heat, the only heat that was provided was in a fireplace. And if you happened to be too far away from the fireplace, you had very little chance. The clothes, when you went in, you had to give up all your belongings, including your clothes. And you were issued with the workhouse clothes. In some places, Castlebar and Westport, they didn't have enough clothes for young people. So what happened was their clothes had they had to wear their own clothes. But why were they segregated? The argument was put by George Nichols, the architect of the workhouse system and the poor law, that by segregating children from their parents, you would reduce the likelihood of them becoming paupers when they were adults. That was the argument. What we see is basically a middle class argument, not taking into consideration the condition of the individuals involved. But by 1845, the problem with the potato became very, very evident. This is from the Mayo Constitution. Large quantities of materials have an examination afterwards being unfit for use. So generally it's that we have heard some gentlemen of experience say that they greatly fear there will hardly be a sound potato in the country in a month or two. The first indication that there was a problem with potatoes in Ireland was in August. It was in November that the Mayo Telegraph and the Mayo Constitution were highlighting the problem that was to be found with the potato. But nobody was too worried. In the previous famines, the year afterwards, you had a bumper crop of potatoes, and people got by. In 1845, 1/3 of the potato crop is ruined and is destroyed. And the feeling being, 1846, the potato crop will be great. But 1846 was a total disaster when it came to the potato crop. Under the Poor Law and the financing of the Poor Law, it was dependent on agriculture and the produce from agriculture. One of the big arguments I constantly make when I'm writing is that the Poor Law should never have been introduced in Ireland in the way it was similar to Britain. In Britain, you were talking about an urban and industrialised society. In Ireland, you were talking an agricultural and rural society. In Mayo, 78% of the population depended on agriculture. So when agriculture was going to be in trouble, the Poor Law was going to be in trouble because people couldn't pay the rates. It happened as well. Anybody under with a valuation on their land of £4 didn't have to pay. So the group that was paying the rates was very, very small. It was nearly impossible to collect rates. Rate collectors were attacked. Castlebar guardians found it virtually impossible to get rate collectors to take on the job because they were afraid they'd be killed. There was also the problem, the embezzlement of money. One of the big problems with the poor law, it could not borrow money for current affairs. The only way it could get money for the day-to-day running of the workhouse was increasing the rates on ratepayers who were already struggling, many of them in a condition not too dissimilar to people who were inside in the workhouse. So you can see here where the problems are. That the agricultural system was not suitable for financing the workhouse and its payments. But while 1845, though the problem with the potato, the really big issue which creates absolute chaos for the workhouse system is the events of 1847. In 1847, you have the ending of the public works. These were works that were introduced in 1846 to provide employment. One of the particular works here in Castlebar was the draining of the Castlebar River. Nationally, you had 740,000, nearly 750,000, who were dependent on the public works. By September, they had no job, they had no food, they had no place to go, except the workhouse. The other feature was the introduction of what was called the Gregory Clause. William Gregory happened to be the husband of Lady Gregory, and he introduced this clause in 1847, which stated if you had more than a quarter of an acre of land, you were not entitled to relief. What it meant was that you have large-scale evictions that take place as landlords evict tenants in order to get rid of them. Anything between a quarter of a million and 500,000 are evicted. The reason we can't be entirely sure, eviction records and notice to quit records only start in 1849. But those who were evicted in 1847 and 1848 were not exactly sure of the figures. In Mayo, about 22,500 are evicted. But the figure is probably much greater than this, because large numbers of tenants voluntarily gave up their holdings and did not question what was happening. We know that even before this, 1846 and early 1847, the number of notices to quit was very high. It was 1,140 for that particular period. Okay, I'll put this in context with you. It's not for political reasons or anything like that. In Mayo, in 15-month period, you have 1,140 notices to quit. In 2025, in Galway City and County, you had 1,200 notices to quit. But what happens is these people have no place to go, and they end up in a totally underfunded workhouse system. Who are the people that are carrying out these evictions in Castlebar? One of the biggest evictors in the country is Lord Lucan. In particular, about 2,000 people are evicted in the Ballinroad, Port But here we look, Lucan had about 60,000 acres of an estate in Mayo. 56 people in Sarna, 68 in Ardvarney, and 39 in Garris Hill were evicted between late 1847 and early 1848. Another one who was very much involved in evicting his tenants was Sir Richard O'Donnell. And between in 1849, he evicts 200 people in Island Navy and Glen Island. And this was the report from the Mayo Telegraph of one group that were evicted in Glen Island. No mercy was displayed towards any one of the besieged. One man in the convulsive pangs of death was thrown onto the open air, and in an hour or two, death put an end to his miserable existence. It just shows the type of sort of feeling that there was in relation to tenants. Mayo had one of the highest levels of evictions in the period 1847 to 1848. It results in 29% of the total population of Mayo being dependent on sort of relief from the poor law or from outdoor relief to look after them. And when you look at it compared to other counties, in July of 1849, nationally, there are well over 750,000 people receiving food in order to remain alive, either in the workhouses or from outdoor sort of relief. And if you look down here in Castlebar, 1847 to 1849, 8,600 people come into the workhouse at some stage. And they just come on to this in a little while. Okay, what were the numbers in Castlebar Workhouse? I mentioned to you how at one stage they would only allow a new pauper in when somebody died or somebody left. But by 1849, the numbers began to increase. Nevertheless, between 1845 and 1848, you have nearly 4,600 people who spent time in the workhouse. In 1 week, in 1848, the 7th of September, 409 people were admitted into a building that could accommodate 700. So you can imagine the chaos, the pressure that people are under. By 1848, 46%, nearly half of the population of Castlebar Union, are being kept alive either through the workhouse or through receiving sort of relief. It just provides you with some indication, and this was something I came across which I thought was really sort of indicating what your crisis was. The numbers who applied for relief in Castlebar between February and March 1849, and what you actually sort of see, the numbers applying for for relief, it's about 12,000. And the numbers who are sort of enter the workhouse, I think it's nearly 900. But the number of people who are rejected, even though their cases are nearly as bad as people who are being accepted, it's on account of the pressure that the workhouse system and the poor law guardians are under. And as I said earlier, we don't know many of these people who had to use the workhouse. We know of Mrs. Reed and her 3 children, and what happened to the 3 children. And part of the reason is the Poor Law Union minute books do not really give you a full indication of who's coming, who they are, on account of the fact what they deal with. They're standardised. It's the same form that is used in every workhouse and by the Board of Guardians. In terms of the number sort of in the workhouse, the resolutions that are passed, the correspondence, but they tell you nothing about the individual paupers that are in there. I mentioned how in 1849, 923,000 people entered the workhouse. We do not have an account of the circumstances and the conditions of one of these who was inside of those workhouses. Why? Largely on account of the fact the information is provided by the Polo Union officials, sometimes the workhouse masters, sort of board of guardians. In other words, the middle classes. Now in 1849, there was a whole series of parliamentary select committees, which inquires into the Irish poor law. And they interview something like 200 people. There is not one person who had been inside in the workhouse, given evidence of that. Why? They had all their meetings in London. If somebody wanted to give evidence, they had to pay their expenses to go to London. So that is why the information that you get tends to show the middle class nature of who is asking questions. The only way that you get some semblance, there are a number of Catholic priests who actually go to London. There's Father John O'Sullivan from Kenmare. There's Father Daly from Galway. But these are few and far between who actually provide the witness statements as to what is going on. The fact that the workhouses were having problems in taking in people, it can be seen in terms of what the Mayo Telegraph came up with. We look upon this morally impossible. They can never succeed in appeasing the wants of the thousands of applicants, which every day throng to the precincts of the portals. It just gives you some idea that what outsiders were actually looking at and what they were seeing was happening in the workhouse. When you entered the workhouse, one way it was put, you were really going into a prison. It was a prison-like environment. The fact of the segregation of members of the family who never saw each other, never spoke to each other while they were inside there. But if you broke the rules, there were very severe penalties. If you used obscene language, insulting behaviour, unnecessary noise, refusing to work, smoking, the possession of tobacco, absconding from the workhouse, possession of alcohol. The punishments included solitary confinement for 24 hours, in which you got no food or milk. The withdrawal of food, and in particular milk. Milk seemed to be the big thing that they decided they should be stopped. Or you could be sent before the courts. There is evidence of one workhouse, one pauper, being sent before the courts because he tore the workhouse blanket. Another incident of somebody being sent before the court was where the pauper sold the workhouse shoes. And they sent it to 28 days confinement for that. The other major issue was that of food. The food was basic, and very often the food was even worse than would be had on the outside. But in relation to many of the people in Mayo and in Castlebar, the food that was on offer in the workhouses was very similar, basically, to what they were having at home. This is one of the statements. It comes from Ennis Timon, but there is a very, very similar statement in relation to Castlebar. The soup is nothing more than meal and water, without either pepper or vegetables of any kind. And I strongly recommend that the necessary adoption be made in the preparation of it, or that it will be done away with. In 1851, a committee that inquired into Castlebar Workhouse was extremely critical of the food that was being given out to people, and I'll explain in a moment. In Ennistown as well, children have not tasted milk for 6 weeks, and those between 9 and 15 have been given inferior soup. In Castlebar, there was a continuous problem with milk. The gardens were unable to get milk supplies. Why? What they were paying was very little. In 1851, instead of paying the 2 and 3 farthings for a quart, they decided to reduce it to a penny halfpenny, halved it nearly. What happened was they got one person to supply it, but when they went and examined the milk he had bought in, it was 1 part milk and 16 parts water. But he had also, they put in chalk to give it the white colour. Now, milk was so important, especially for children, on account of the fact for the protein, for the vitamins that are needed, milk is the staple that is required. But very often, the children were the ones who were giving inferior milk, or in some cases, no milk at all. There was also a problem with the supply of bread. And the supply of bread, it was found, originally it was the miller. And then it was found that the miller was okay, but it was the baker. So the baker for Castlebar Workhouse was fired. And a new replacement sought, which it took them weeks to actually get. But we see here, in relation to your food, the whole question with the boards of guardians was, can we reduce the quantity and the quality of food? Every meal that an inmate got was weighed. The recommendation was for 12 ounces. 12 ounces of bread or the equivalent. And sometimes it was 9 ounces. Sometimes it was 6 ounces. There was an incident in Castlebar where 12 of the women complained that the food that they were given was less than what they were entitled to. The master maintained that one of them, Mary Burke, had went and taken the bowl, which was a wooden plate, and it went off and came back 3 minutes later, and when he reweighed it, it was 3 ounces less. So he maintained she had eaten some of it and then was back for more. Mary Burke was dragged away and put into a cell for 24 hours. There was a case as well of where people were put into solitary confinement. 12 girls, aged in their late teens. It happened that they refused to do knitting because the food that they were given was of such an inferior quantity. They maintained they had been given dry stirabout. There was no liquid and it was unedible. They were all dragged off and put into cells by the master and the matron. I mentioned to you how some of the work I've done has been in relation to rioting and insubordination. The 53 riots that I have labelled, all of them are initiated and carried out by women. And part of the reason for it is how demoralised and unhappy they were in the workhouse. They had no sense of what their future was going to be like. No, I'll skip that because I haven't mentioned it. The big problem the workhouses had and Castlebar had was in relation to finance. In 1848, the workhouse would have had to be closed, except for a contribution from the British Relief Association. And I'll show you in a moment, about £16,000. But here for 1848, the income that they got was 25,000, but expenditure was 49,000. The debt that they had at the end of that year was over 20,000, and money was not coming in. It was only that in 1848, money from the British Relief Association, because the British Relief Association, they gave the 16,000 to Castlebar, but when you look at Ballina, 24,000. In total, they applied 143,000 to the workhouses. Otherwise, the workhouses would have had to let sort of paupers sort of leave. By the end of 1848, the way the government responded was to set up what we call the Rating Aid. In other words, well-off workhouses and poor law unions in Ulster and Leinster would support those in the west and the south. Okay, leave that as well. There were 2 to 3 times as many women in the workhouses as there were men during the famine period. One of the rules that you had was that if a family was coming in, the whole family had to come in. But what very often happened was, after a few days, the father, the husband, he disappeared. He left in search of work. In some cases, he left so that he could go to America in sort of search of work. For females, the issue was, were they deserted, or what was the story? And in some cases, some of them were deserted, but in many cases, it was their way of getting the safety net, of being looked after. Okay, I realise I've gone a little bit over, so I'm going to...
They have to go to work.
Not to worry. But we get one sense here, that is sort of said. The men, these are people who go off to America. The men forget they have wives and families at home. Their wives and families remain as permanent paupers in the workhouse. Now, the big worry that they had was the cost. On average, it was costing £5 per inmate per year. And if, their families were going to be there for 10 years, 15 years, we were talking about maybe sort of £50 for each individual that it was going to cost. So this was the great worry that they had about wives and children. And the Castlebar Guardians actually took legal action against men who deserted their wives and complained that not enough was being done. Just to speed this up, the children in the workhouses, 4 groups, largely those who entered with their families, those who were orphans, those who were deserted or abandoned, and you had a group as well that were illegitimate. And as I mentioned earlier, children very often were left because it was a safety net. For example, Mrs. Reid that we spoke about at the beginning, if she hadn't left her 3 children in the workhouse, they would have died without having sufficient food. All right, when they went into the workhouse, it was the chance that they had to take. And this was one of the huge issues that you had at this time. I mentioned earlier that in some places, children comprised 60%, nearly 2/3 of the total population in sort of workhouses. In places like Castlebar, it was between 40 and 45 percent. One of the points that was made was people who entered the workhouse, especially when they were young, they received no training. They weren't able to go out into the world. They basically had become institutionalized. And even moving on, and this was a point that was made, they acquired no knowledge of any kind of household work. They had nothing to do but attend to their meals or their schools. And this was, again, a middle-class argument that was being put forward as to why these people were staying longer in the workhouses than they should. But there's just two more things I really want to talk to you to mention. One of the ways that in 1848 you have the decision by the British government, by Earl Grey, that he would take money or take women from the workhouse and send them to Australia. Why? There were 8 men to every woman in Australia. They needed wives. They also needed servants. People in girls in the workhouses in England and Wales refused to go to Australia. It was a penal colony. And so they turned their attention to Ireland, and 4,114 were sent. Now, one of the descendants of one of those girls, okay, we all know Thomas Keneally, the playwright, Schindler's Ark. His great-grandmother left Skibbereen Workhouse. But it's just interesting that places like Skibbereen and Enniskillen have very large numbers of girls that are sent out to Australia. Ballina is by far the best of the Mayo workhouses. But when we look at Castlebar, 15. And the reason these 15, it was girls inside in the workhouse who pleaded to be sent. And they eventually were sent on the Panama and landed in Sydney in January of 1850. And we know something about them. Of the 15 girls, we know the information about 14. The fact the Australians were paying for, to bring these girls to Australia, they took sort of very detailed information about the families. And okay, what we see here is, sort of as well is the sisters, Anna Madden and Celia Madden. There's other ones as well, another set of sisters as well. But they had to be orphans. And the thing was, they had to be aged between 14 and 18. Now, they had to, but the thing is, the workhouse authorities played around with the figures. Just like they do later, when they send girls to Canada. Okay, I've come across one case from Montpellier. The girl is supposed to be 18. When she arrives in Canada, she's suddenly 40. She has been in the workhouse for about 10 years. First in Ballinasloe and then in Montpellier. She leaves in 1852 and arrives in Canada. 1853. Mark McGowan has found out, in a collaboration we've done, that she's in a lunatic asylum outside Toronto. So she's left one asylum in Ireland for another asylum, and she's in that asylum until she dies in the 1880s. So you see how fast and loose the guardians sort of could play. But we know a certain amount of them. Okay, some where they actually were initially found work. But one thing that's very interesting, a number of them were dismissed very quickly for being disobedient and insubordinate. So even though they had been sent out, and were supposed to be a good character, not all of them were of good character. Okay, I'll move on. Okay, what were the diseases? There are quite a number of diseases, which leads to the very high mortality rate. Dysentery, diarrhea, typhus, cholera, measles, ophthalmia. One of the big ones was typhus. And the reason why typhus became such a major, major problem, when people came into the workhouse, they were given the uniforms of people who had died. They hadn't been washed, they hadn't been cleaned. Typhus is carried on by lice. And the lads were living in these particular uniforms and then passed on, and as a result, typhus spread. Another problem was sending people from one part of a workhouse to another. And as a result, okay, they might have, they were bringing typhus or measles with them from the main workhouse to another the auxiliary workhouses, which had been taken up. One of the things that's really important, with regard to the figures and the information supplied by the British authorities, they come with a certain question mark. On account of the fact, by 1849, 1850, the conditions in the workhouses, the number of deaths, the levels of diseases were so high that the authorities were afraid that it would lead to public outcry and there would be major retributions. So they started massaging the figures. And we can see it in Castlebar. In the March of 1850, in 1 week, the authorities said 16 people had died. The Mayo Telegraph gave the names, gave the dates they died, gave the reasons they died, and their ages for the 20 instead of 16. The previous week, Penrose, the clerk, had said 25 people had died. The Mayo Telegraph, producing the information, said it was 36. So you can see how the manipulation of figures. One of these was a Miss Maxwell, aged 16, does not appear in the official records. She was buried at night in the Church of Ireland cemetery. And again, no indication whatever in the records that are in the Port Union records. The other thing was children were being buried, sometimes 2 in a coffin, because there was a scarcity of coffins. Okay, just to conclude, the workhouses were never designed to deal with the famine, and they certainly were not designed to deal with the famine in a place like Castlebar, which was regarded as one of the 8 most destitute Port Unions in the country. It was the more vulnerable people, like women and children, who suffered most, largely because the way in which they were treated. Really what we need, and it hasn't been done yet, when there has been work on Port Unions like in Kinsale, they don't really look at between the lines. Something we used to always say to students, both in Maynooth and in Galway, when you'd be dealing with documents. It is not the answers that you get, it's the questions that you ask that provide that little bit of information as what it's all about. But here I think the Illustrated London News in December of 1849 really highlighted the poor law, said to be for the relief of the people and the means for their salvation, was the instrument of their destruction. And that was certainly evident in the case of Castlebar Workhouse. Okay, thank you.